Hi, everybody. Today, we're going to be going through the home inspection process according to our current standard forms. It can be very confusing. It is very clearly laid out what the process is, but then life happens and transactions happen and things outside of the scope of what the contract calls for happens. So we have to have a very firm understanding of what the contract actually calls for, because that's the framework from which we should be vetting every question we have and every gray area that pops up. So briefly, I'd like to just run through the process first of all. And the process is detailed in two places. That's in the purchase agreement, and then additionally on the inspection addendum. So for the RVAR contract, clause 15 is where you indicate as a buyer's agent whether this contract is contingent or not contingent upon inspections. That can be any inspections. A lot of times buyer's agents will interpret that as the home inspection, but it doesn't necessarily, I know that's the primary inspection we think of, but it could be any inspection. It could be simply just the Western Virginia Water Authority's inflow and infiltration inspection. That's an inspection. So if there are any inspections whatsoever, you need to be checking the is contingent upon. And what that means is the results of the inspections will somehow impact the path forward for this contract to go to closing or not go to closing. If the contract is not contingent upon inspections, I think you need to be very, very clear with that buyer's agent with that listing agent, what you mean by that. Do you mean that you don't want the contract to be contingent upon the results of the inspections, or that you don't even intend as the buyer to have any inspections? And I get a lot of phone calls from buyer's agents or listing agents saying this contract was not contingent upon inspections, and now they'd like to have an inspection for their own knowledge. Okay, this is happening frequently. Buyer's agents are trying to write competitive offers. Buyers are getting swept up in the moment and saying, okay, well, let's just have one for our knowledge only. Well, I can assure you that when the knowledge comes back that there are discoveries on that property, and they're 2 weeks past that frenzy of the bidding war, they're not necessarily as pleased with themselves about making a contract not contingent upon inspections. So you need to have very candid conversations with your buyers before you make the offer. Do they want the house at any cost? Or do they want to keep in the inspection contingencies? And it may mean it's going to take a lot longer to get a house. So if you can have clear communication with the listing agent, if you can write really expressive language in our standard form that's going to detail exactly what you want to have happen. And I'll tell you one good thing that, in my opinion, that has come out of this insane market is that I do see that we are moving towards a due diligence contract. So a little birdie has let me know that a due diligence contract is coming, and we will be discussing that at the end of this topic today. And I'm going to tell you why I like it. There are pros and cons with a due diligence contract, but it does help everyone's expectations be a little more clear. So currently, our standard contract and our standard inspection addendum call for, let's assume it is contingent upon inspections, any inspections. When you check the box in clause 15 of the purchase agreement that it's going to be contingent upon inspections, it says right there in the standard language that the inspection addendum will have to be attached to the contract and become part of the contract. The inspection addendum is going to go on to detail what inspections the buyer is making the contract contingent upon. That is always open for counteroffers. If the seller says, absolutely not, I do not want you having this, that, or the other inspection, that is certainly a counteroffer. And the buyer has to decide whether they're willing to forego those inspections or not. So I always want you to be having open communication with the other agent about whether they intend to have the inspection or not. It can be confusing because the buyer's agent may be saying, we're not making it contingent upon inspections, but fully expecting to have a panel of inspections for their buyer's information purposes only. So I want you to have really good communication with the other agent so that everybody's expectations are the same. So we've checked the box in clause 15 that the contract will be contingent upon inspections. It directs us to the inspection addendum to detail those. Please make sure you are including the inspection addendum under the list of addenda on page 1 of the purchase agreement. That spot is what attaches and makes part of the contract an additional form. So we have to make sure we've listed that in the addenda on page 1. So the inspection addendum goes on to say that the buyer will have X numbers of business days to conduct their inspections. I do a minimum of 10 business days. I am seeing 15 business days. And in a regular market, I would, as a seller, I would push back on that. As a listing agent, I would say, no, that's too long of an inspection period. Okay. But in this market, home inspectors are just busy. So we're having to do 15 business days. Western Virginia Water Authority, everyone is having trouble getting to their work right now. It's a very busy time in real estate. So 15 business days is something we're seeing more of. I'm not seeing that necessarily as a red flag. 15 business days, as you can imagine, is a long time because Saturdays and Sundays aren't counting in that. So really, effectively, it could be 3 full weeks. And then you're right at closing. So the buyer puts in how many business days. The inspection addendum already says that the seller can do the seller paid inspections further towards the closing period. That's because we're not going to want, customarily, sellers were responsible for termite inspection, well and septic inspection. That was just by custom. That was not a law. That was not standard by any stretch of the imagination. It was just customary. That was the flavor of our area and how our agents in the Roanoke Valley were writing contracts. Now, it really is my recommendation that you have your buyer conduct all of the inspections. Your buyer is going to be the new homeowner. Your buyer is the one who needs to have the relationship with those inspectors so that when they take title to the home and move in, if there's an issue, they were the ones who ordered that inspection and they can reach back out for assistance from those inspectors. I also think that as part of the buyer's due diligence, it's probably the best business practice for them to be doing their own due diligence and for them to be hiring all of their own inspectors and being in charge of their own inspections. So as you can imagine, a seller obviously is going to do the bare minimum. Of course, they're not going to spend extra money on a buyer. So I am having my buyers do all of the panel of inspections themselves. Now, Western Virginia Water Authority's inflow and infiltration inspection is a little bit different because that is a seller inspection. It is a free inspection where Western Virginia Water Authority comes out and makes sure the gutter downspouts and the sump pump in the basement aren't going into the sewer line. And that is only required when they are provided sewer services from the Western Virginia Water Authority. Some homes in the Western Virginia Water Authority domain have public water from Western Virginia Water Authority, but perhaps they have a septic system. If they have a septic system, then the inflow and infiltration inspection is not required because it really is just all about wastewater going into the sewer lines, which should be going back out into the yard and then draining back down through the ground and going back into the water table. So we have said yes to inspections. We have filled out the inspection addendum. We have listed it on page 1 of the purchase agreement to make sure it's attached to the contract and becomes part of the contract. Now we have on page 2 of the inspection addendum several days to give copies of the reports. I want to be very clear that language is very clear that you are to provide copies of reports within blank business days of receiving, and it uses the word each report. Okay. You're not waiting until all inspections are completed and then sending the listing agent all of the reports. As the buyer's agent, you're putting in a date there, 3 days, 5 days, whatever it is you've filled into that blank. Oh, no, excuse me. The inspection addendum says 3 business days. It is already filled in for you. You have 3 business days to provide copies of reports as you receive them. So you will not wait until you've completed all of the inspection reports. And that means sometimes you may be sending the home inspection report to the listing agent prior to writing up your removal of contingency form, because you may still be waiting on the radon report, or you may still be waiting on the Western Virginia Water Authority report to be able to completely fill out your removal of contingency form. But you still need to make sure you're sending copies of reports. Now, we've sent copies of reports. We've now written up our removal of contingency form, and we have submitted that to the listing agent. As the buyer's agent, we now hold our breath and wait and see what the seller's response is going to be. So some of the flaws in our current procedure are that at that point, when we're writing up the removal of contingency form as the buyer's agent, our buyers are going to be asking for things that are not within the scope of what the seller is required to repair. So on page 1 of the inspection addendum, it talks about how grandfathered systems that are at or beyond their life expectancy, these are not items that the seller is responsible for fixing. So I understand that you've shown up to the home inspection and found out that you and your buyer have paid over list price for a home that has a 42-year-old heat pump. If that heat pump is working, and that heat pump is functioning properly, and the home inspector notices that it is beyond its life expectancy, twice beyond, 3 times beyond its life expectancy, that in and of itself does not make it a defect and does not burden it onto the seller as a seller obligation to be repaired. So you need to be very careful to educate your buyers prior to receiving the home inspection report, or even prior to attending the home inspection. You need to be very clear with them when you're filling out that inspection addendum. When we have our inspection, I want you to understand that we may find that some of the components or some of the systems are very, very old. They only have to function properly. We may find that we have a 30-year roof on the house, but it's very clear in the inspection addendum that the roof only has to not be leaking. So you can have a disgruntled buyer later when they realize, when they feel frustrated that they're buying a home, in their opinion, above market value, and they're getting old components. So those are also things to be looking at as you're viewing the home. As you're viewing the home, you want to pay special attention to the systems and the components. I know nothing about roofs. I'm never going to get on a roof, although I did have a client on a roof one time. I came out and she was on the roof, but had gotten a ladder off of her own truck and climbed up on that roof while I was inside with the home inspector. She was cleaning out the gutters. Yep, can't make it up. So what you want to do is make sure you're educating them up front. That really goes a long way in keeping your buyers from feeling irritated or annoyed that they didn't realize it until too late. Okay. If we get the home inspection report and it says the heat pump is 42 years old, I'm saying to my buyers, yep, just as we suspected, when we looked at that heat pump, it looked really old. Turns out it's really, really old. It's a grandpa heat pump. But as we discussed, we were waiting to find out if it was functioning properly. Looks like it's functioning properly. You guys should probably budget for replacing that during your term of home ownership. I'm glad we weren't, caught unaware about that. I'm glad we took a minute to look at that when we were viewing the home. Okay, you can understand how that does 2 things. It sets the expectations for your buyer that they understand there's going to be some expense later. And it also lets them know you're on their team. You are literally protecting their best interest by being more observant about the property. I'm not telling you to be on a discovery mission when you're viewing the home, but I'm just telling you to look at the components and look at the systems as you're viewing the home and have some conversation with your buyer about it. Okay. Now, What if, as the buyer's agent, we've submitted our inspection repairs on the removal of contingency form, and the listing agent comes back and says, well, we've crossed through 4 items that the seller does not believe are actually material defects. Sometimes buyers and sellers can't get past this point in the transaction. I want you to understand as the agent that there is no inherent termination right built into our purchase agreement or our inspection addendum when there's a stalemate when it comes to the removal of contingency inspection request. You guys can go back and forth 100 times on what is a defect and what is cosmetic. You can go back and forth on what the seller will do or won't do, and neither party has a termination right. Okay? As the buyer's agent, there are more pitfalls for you because you still have to be moving along with perhaps your application of loan, your final loan approval date. Now, one of those dates may come and go while you guys are fighting it out over an ROC, and that would give the seller a termination right. Or if you're the listing agent, be cautious. You may have just provided the POA packet, and now the buyer has a termination right due to the property owners association packet. So if you're in a stalemate, there are some termination rights, but they have absolutely nothing to do with the ROC not getting agreed upon, by not getting executed, not reaching a meeting of the minds. Okay. That is by design, because the old version of the inspection addendum had a 2-day termination right for the buyer if we could not have a meeting of the minds. Well, as you can imagine, that was getting abused all over the place. Okay. It basically gave the buyers a 2-day termination period to just say, I didn't like that inspection report, or I found out there's a house I like better, and they were just terminating. And listing agents and sellers were very frustrated by that. So our current version does not allow for any sort of termination right. Now, this is where I will sometimes counsel you guys to ask for a friendly release, as I call it, which is where you call up the listing agent and you say, hey, we saw the home inspection report. I'm not sending it to you yet, but there were some serious concerns on my buyer's part about some pretty significant deferred maintenance or structural issue or water intrusion or whatever it is. And I'm calling you, unfortunately, to ask for a friendly release. Would the seller consider releasing us? I would be happy to provide you with the home inspection report or not provide you with the home inspection report, whichever you would prefer, listing agent. Some listing agents will say, do not send that to me, because they do not want to have disclosure obligations. The seller would still have no seller disclosure obligations, but the listing agent would. So the listing agent may say, don't even send it to me. I'll talk to my seller. Okay. So the seller may decide to release your buyer, or they may decide to release your buyer for a fee, or they may decide to release your buyer for a forfeiture of the earnest money deposit. There is nothing in our contract or our inspection addendum detailing how that process works. Okay. That's just working it out among the parties to the contract. And they may come back and say, no, we want an opportunity to repair. And, we have had contracts fall apart we have one right now falling apart where the buyer is from another area of the country. And after they were ratified, did some research on radon, and they are too scared to move to Virginia now. So they homeschool. They have a lot of kids who will be homeschooling in the basement of this home, and they are not comfortable moving forward with this home, even with a radon mitigation system. Well, we don't have a termination right while representing them on cold feet. The time for doing due diligence was before we were ratified about radon. So we are asking for a friendly release, and we are hoping to be released. We have heard that they are willing to do so, but it's going to probably cost us some money to get out of the contract. And that's worth it to these buyers. So if you have a situation like this, just call me and we'll navigate through it, and I can give you some recommendations, and we can even get the brokers involved to try to see if we can find some sort of common goal to get the house back on the market, but it may cost the buyer something to get out. Okay. What are the termination rights the buyers have? Well, the buyer's agent submits the removal of contingency form detailing our request. The seller gets back to us, and the seller has two options in clause 17 of the purchase agreement. Those two options for the seller are fulfill seller's entire obligation, which is sign that form and then fix everything. Okay. And it has to be done by a licensed contractor. So if the seller says, I'm going to do the whole list, and they sign it and they return it, the buyer is now locked into that contract. There is no termination right. There is no walk away, because the seller is now making that property whole. So the seller is now satisfying any and all obligations the seller may have to convey a good, safe working home. So the seller has a second option. They can say, you know what? We're just going to credit you the repair remediation limit that's indicated in clause 17. We're going to credit that at closing to the buyer in lieu of repairs, or to a contractor of the buyer's choosing, which sometimes has to happen because the lender will not allow the seller to give any more contributions to the buyer. So if you've written a conventional loan contract and you ask for the seller to pay 3% of the purchase price towards your buyer's closing costs, that is the maximum allowed in seller concessions. So now if that seller wants to give $1,500 in lieu of repairs at closing to the buyer cannot accept it, because the buyer has already accepted the maximum amount of seller paid concessions. So in that instance, it's going to probably be best to just issue that as a payment to a vendor of the buyer's choosing. Now, I've seen that in all sorts of iterations. I've seen that show up as a $1,500 payment to Fashion Floors. I've seen that show up as a $1,500 payment to a contractor, to a radon mitigation system installer, any sort of as a home warranty program. There are all sorts of ways to spend that money that the buyer can benefit from it after closing, but not receive it in their hands at the closing table. Okay. It cannot be a check handed to them outside of closing. Okay. That could get them into some hot water with their mortgage company. So please try to avoid that at all costs. Yes. So the seller has either said, I'll fulfill my full obligations, or I will credit you the mitigation, the repair remediation limit. If they choose the repair remediation limit in clause 17 of the purchase agreement, the buyer then has two options, and only two options. They will either accept the property in as-is condition and the repair remediation limit money, either to them directly in the form of closing costs, or it could also be a reduction in the sale price of the home, or to a vendor of their choosing. Or the buyer can terminate the contract, receive a full refund of their earnest money deposit, and not be deemed in default. Okay. This is why, as a listing agent, I'm always telling my seller, no, let's just hustle and try to get it all done. Let's just satisfy all of our obligations. I do not want to give the buyers a termination right if I can help it. Now, the reason why it was written the way it was written is, let's take the roof, for example. The roof is something that the buyer may not be able to really thoroughly do their due diligence on prior to writing the contract. Okay. And it may also be an item that the seller doesn't know has flaws. So if the home inspection reveals leaks all over the place in the attic, and for some reason the seller has not noticed and the buyer did not notice, and now we have to do $5,000 worth of work on the roof to satisfy the seller's obligations. The seller doesn't have $5,000 to fix the roof. Okay. So the seller says, I'm so sorry, but the only thing I can do is credit you the $1,500 or the $1,000 that was in clause 17 of the purchase agreement, which is the repair remediation limit. Well, the seller doesn't have to spend $5,000 fixing the roof, but also the buyer does not have to be burdened with that expense as soon as they close on the house. So that's why that repair remediation limit was conceived of in the first place. It's a threshold to say, seller, you won't be obligated to more than that, but buyer, you also won't be expected to close on a property that has more than that in material defects. So it really does give both parties an option. I do like it. It's all humans doing this job. So we find ourselves in these gray areas that the contract can't quite, it's not a one size fits all. So where we find ourselves having a breakdown is when we start arguing over cosmetic versus defective. Because as you can imagine, again, this is all humans doing this. Whether it's cosmetic or defective depends on who you are representing, right? There are some items that will always just be cosmetic or defective. If the radon level has been tested and it's come back in at 17, it's barring the seller deciding to have another test on their own dime and then arguing about it. It's going to be hard to argue that there isn't a high level of radon that needs to be addressed. Okay. But most of the other things we find, soot on a furnace that is indicative of like a flame out. Well, was that old? Is that soot cosmetic? Is it really indicative of an ongoing problem? Was it something the seller already had fixed? Another one is little holes in the vinyl siding. Somebody's mowing the lawn and a rock shoots up and knocks a hole in the vinyl siding. Is that cosmetic or is that defective? The listing agent is going to tell you it's cosmetic. The buyer's agent is going to tell you that it is allowing water intrusion, so it's defective. I don't know who wins. I would love to tell you who wins, but my first question when I'm looking at that is, who are you working for? And you may have had that experience with me where you call me and you start in on the details and I stop you and I say, now, are you representing the seller or the buyer? It's not that I'm just picky about, giving me all the details. It's that I need to know whose hat do I have on? Am I working for the buyer or am I working for the seller? If I'm working for the buyer, I'm trying to get that seller to pay for anything and everything, right? But if I'm working for the seller, I don't want to spend a whole lot of my seller's money. So it truly does depend on who you're working for. So cosmetic versus defective is never going to be an easy answer because it depends. Okay. Rhonda, yes, let me unmute you.
Okay.
Hi.
Hey, so let me make sure that I have this right. If it's a material defect, then if the cost to fix it is above and beyond the repair mediation limit set in clause 17, the seller has to either fix it or give a credit. Is that accurate?
So the seller takes a look at the whole list. And let's say the repair remediation limit was set at $1,500. Mm-hmm. The seller can either do the whole list or credit the repair remediation limit, the whole $1,500. That's what our contract says. Now, that's not always what happens. Sometimes, there are 1,000 different variations of that. But that's what the contract says. So that's my advice when folks call, is try to get the work done. If the work is, you can understand, we go into the gray area of, okay, seller doesn't want to do the work. The seller also recognizes that it's more than $1,500. Mm-hmm. So the seller has said, Ashley, as my listing agent, you have my permission to call that buyer's agent and offer them $2,500. See if they'll take that. Well, the contract doesn't call for that response. That's not written anywhere in there. Okay. But it happens all the time. Mm-hmm. And if there's a meeting of the minds, great, and we move forward. But it's not one of the sanctioned options that are in our standard language. But again, that's where I say it's just a bunch of humans doing this job. So we end up, it's not a one size fits all. It's a guide, and it's what I can dig into and try to make our position if an argument comes up later. But it's certainly not what we see happen every single time.
So even if it is a material defect, like a leaky roof, mm-hmm. the seller only has to, per the contract, repair $1,500 worth or give a credit of $1,500.
No, they have to fix the entire roof
That's what
they have to fix the defect
yeah.
or credit the repair remediation limit.
And that's
Okay.
why I was chiming in, because we see that all the time. The sellers agree to do the list, and then when they get into the meat of it, it ends up being more than that limit. And they're like, well, I'm done. I'm not making anything else right. But no, you agreed to do that. So you have to follow through with it. Just
That's right.
That limit does not mean you can stop working.
And that is an excellent cautionary tale there is, as the listing agent, do not recommend that your seller sign that removal of contingency form unless you have estimates. Unless it is very clearly obvious that it's not going to meet that repair remediation limit. Like, let's say the only things that came up were 2 toilets that are a little loose on the floor. Great, sign it. Let's get it done. However, if you don't have estimates for a lengthier or a more unknown list of repairs, you are setting your seller up for having to spend more than the remediation limit, because the estimates may come in high. So sometimes I will recommend that you ask, as the listing agent, that you ask for an extension on what we call the seller response time. Because if the buyer's agent has filled out the inspection addendum and given the seller 3 business days to respond to the removal of contingency form, that's oftentimes not enough time to get the vendors out there to give you estimates. So I would recommend the listing agent ask for an extension to continue to gather estimates. Not because you're trying to be difficult, but because you want to make sure you really can do the whole list at an affordable fee for your seller. And we have seen that happen. And I've had to be the bad guy and say, look, seller, I mean, I understand this has come back more than we expected, but we signed that form stating that we would have that work completed. We are going to have to complete that work. And that is when they start looking at you and asking what you're going to do to help them. So if you don't want them in your pocketbook, then it's going to be best to get estimates prior to making a decision on whether they're going to repair the list or whether they're going to credit the repair remediation limit. Did that answer your question, Rhonda?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, of course, of course. So, and thank you for chiming in. I appreciate that. So that takes me to, well, first, my last piece on that is, if you're having trouble with it, call me, okay? I've done every iteration of this you can ever possibly imagine, down to, and Jennifer, this may have even been before Jennifer's time. This is before I was in charge, but we had one fall apart because nobody would get the dead squirrel out of the attic, okay? That was cosmetic versus defective, and it fell apart. And I found out about it after, and I was like, why did no one call me? I'll go in an attic and get a dead squirrel out for $3,000. Come on, y'all. So call me if you're finding a breakdown in communication. Call me if you're having a discussion about cosmetic versus defective. Call me if you're the buyer's agent and you're curious if you should or should not put one of these items on your list, okay? Same, call me if you're the listing agent and you've got a list of items and you're concerned some of them might not be defective, okay? I had a weird one time, and it was that the electrical panel box, the electrical panel for the whole house, was literally in the bathroom right next to the shower. So that seems like a bad idea. I'm not sure who thought that was a great idea. However, is that a defect? I mean, it's not a great idea, but I'm not so sure it was a defect. We eventually worked it out, but it's just funky things are going to happen. All right. So that takes us to the due diligence contract. I just want to give you just a little intro into what a due diligence contract is, the pros, some of the pros and some of the cons of a due diligence contract. All that means is that there is not going to be this repair remediation limit per se. Instead, and oftentimes there is now an additional fee for the buyer. The buyer will be placing an earnest money deposit on the home, and they'll also be placing a due diligence fee on the home. And that amount of money is non-refundable or refundable, but most of the times the sellers are going to make it non-refundable. And it's essentially a payment for the buyer to just have a look at the house. So there'll be a due diligence period, which I assume will end up being similar to our inspection period. So 10 business days, 15 business days. And the buyer will get to have any and all inspections, and then they'll get to decide whether they're moving forward or not. None of this back and forth. None of this, is it cosmetic? Is it defective? Well, the way it's written now, we find buyers and sellers kind of trapped in a contract, right? And trapped into this cosmetic versus defective fight. In a due diligence contract, the buyer always has a termination right. So they can always terminate and walk away if we get into this sort of death match. The pros, that's obviously the pros. The cons, you can have a buyer then leveraging that termination right 3 weeks into the contract. So the buyer may start making all sorts of demands. Now, Kelly, if you don't mind me asking, are you guys a due diligence contract in Arizona?
Yes, we're property is as is. You get 10 days. You can ask for repairs. Seller isn't obligated to make any. You give your list. If they turn down one item, then the buyer can decide whether to walk. If they fix everything on your list, then you're going to close.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Cosmetic, I mean, it has to be a valid request. We got one last week where they asked for a crane as the repair. They wanted us to rent a crane for them to put a new AC unit on the house. And we're like, yeah, not a valid request. The house doesn't come with a crane, so good luck with that. We're moving to close. But virtually anything else, I mean, not paint, but you know, we don't have it per se. Cosmetic is not allowed. But yeah, they can pretty much ask for anything, and then you decide if you do and you don't, and moving on.
I like it.
Now we don't have the due diligent fee. I tried that after one of your meetings.
Yeah.
When
Because
you
North
said
Carolina
does it. Yeah. And I
Yeah.
said, okay, guys, here's another way. Let's see if we can just offer to get our contracts accepted. And everybody's like, what the hell is this? And no, you know, so no one in Arizona got picked that up. And I was sure I had brought something new and was going to take off, but no.
Okay.
No.
But that's what North Carolina's doing, and it's all
Right.
non-refundable, and it is also an item that can be negotiated. So
Right.
the buyer may say, I'm going to put down a $1,000 due diligence fee, and the seller may say, we have 12 offers. That will be $5,000. If we're going to take it off the market for you to have a look, we want a $5,000 non-refundable. I mean, that can happen. And you
Yeah.
can see how at Smith Mountain Lake, you can see how that would happen, you know, or could happen.
And right now we're doing, unfortunately, $5,000 non-refundable earnest money sight unseen. Haven't even been in the house to be able to get your offer accepted.
Woof.
So they can still get out, but they ain't taking their 5,000 with them.
Right. Right.
Yeah. But again, then you get involved with the FHA, VA amendatory clause but then you got to go through the appraisal and get out that way. And
Right.
then that starts all that other stuff that brokers don't like to talk about.
Well, we wouldn't have jobs if,
And we wouldn't be the broker if we weren't broker than most.
yeah. Right. All right. So without getting really heavily into the due diligence process, because that'll be for another day, I'm going to move on, but I want to open it up, see if anybody has any questions about our current inspection process. I suspect it's not going to be that way for too terribly much longer, but all of the best business practices we've just discussed about having that open communication with your buyer prior to even writing a contract, you can tell how that's going to go forward no matter what style of contract we begin writing. Samantha, did you have a question?
You're muted, Sam.
I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
you have the home inspection and things come back on it, like the leaky roof.
Mhm.
Wouldn't an appraiser pick up on that? And then the seller would have to do it if he wanted to sell the house, if it was a appraisal condition?
So the contract also discusses what they call lender required repairs, which is appraisal required repairs. So it states in that clause, and I believe it is still clause 13. It's the section where we write how many days they have to apply for the loan. Okay. The second paragraph in that clause talks about if there are lender required repairs, the seller is not obligated to make those repairs. However, they have to allow the buyer to make the repairs at the buyer's expense prior to closing. So in that case, if an appraisal required repair came up that there needs to be a handrail going down the basement stairs, and the seller says, nope, I'm not doing it. I've already done that entire list of repairs you gave me. I am done. Seller does not have to do it, but the seller has to allow the buyer to do it. Now, again, it has to be done by a licensed contractor, and that can be hard on an FHA buyer or a USDA buyer or a VHDA, VA buyer, because they've got to hire a contractor to go put up a handrail, right? The seller and the buyer could agree to allow the buyer to do it themselves, but that gets a little tricky for the listing agent to recommend they let some buyer come over and put a bunch of holes in the wall. So the seller can't bar the buyer from doing it. They have to allow the buyer to do it at the buyer's expense prior to closing. Now, one of our agents recently had a home that came up with just a laundry list of appraisal required repairs. It was too many for the seller to want to do. And ultimately, it was too many for the buyer to feel comfortable with completing on their own prior to closing. Because what if the seller was like, well, thanks for making my house nice, and now I'm just not going to go to closing. Go sue me, right? So now the buyer would have spent, a couple $1,000s fixing up their house for them. And so they were not comfortable moving forward with that. Okay, any other questions before I just give you a quick little electronic signature best business practice? Anybody? Okay, I'm gonna move on then. So best business practices with electronic signatures. We're doing them a lot now. Just a very simple one I want to share, and you've probably heard me share it before, but I just think it's so important. Anytime you're going to send a packet out for electronic signatures, I want you to commit to sending those documents as a PDF first. So I want you to download it as a PDF, send it to your client, and say, here are the documents I'm getting ready to send you for electronic signatures. Please review them and let me know if there are any corrections needed or you have any questions about the document. And then send it to them for their electronic signatures. The reason being is if you've never been on the receiving end of an electronic signature packet, the way it works is they get this 7-page purchase agreement with all the addenda, and they click start. And then it goes page 1, and they click a button and add their electronic signature under the agency portion of page 1 of the purchase agreement. And when they click that signature and click next, it goes and 5 pages go flying up the screen. And now they're on the signature page on page 6 or 7. Well, I'm not convinced they're really reviewing that or reading that, okay? And I don't want there to ever be an argument from a buyer who says, well, I didn't really have a chance to read it. I'm not very good at technology. I didn't know how to go back up and look at those pages, okay? So my best business practice is that will never be an argument for any of my clients because they're going to have a PDF of it sitting in their email, and I can show that I have sent that prior to ever sending them the electronic signature one. Now, this goes for inspection addendums, amendments, anything. I just have a rule for myself, and I would love for this to be your rule, that before I send the electronic signature package, I'm going to send it as a PDF to their email, okay? That one little thing may prevent something blowing up on you later, you know. Plus, anytime we're getting into habits and doing things exactly the same way, if a glitch happens and somebody decides to come after you for something, you can show that you've been doing it exactly the same way for 10 years. Why would you have done it any differently this time? And so it really supports your best business practices and how you do business. And then it looks like we're not even going to get to red flags with customers and clients. As always, y'all, I think I'm going to go fast and then I can really drag it out. So we will save that one for another morning. Do you guys have any questions or anything you'd like to add before we sign off today?